Holy Grail and the Aurora Borealis. And in a way, it's a mixture of a whole lot of subject. My background is Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science or anthroposophy, but it's connecting the whole subject of the the subject of the Holy Grail with the phenomena of the Aurora Borealis, this amazing phenomenon that is apparent at the North and South Pole, but I'm really dealing more with it at the North Pole. And in Steiner's descriptions of the very earliest time of our present Earth evolution, he speaks of a paradise time. And so I'm going to link the phenomena of the Aurora Borealis with things that happen towards the end of paradise. All the world's holy books speak of a fall into matter. And I'm going to link the end of paradise with the aurora and with another subject which I've spoken about, two Austrian scientists who came over to England about 10 years ago, who had discovered that healthy water contains particular dowsable resonance patterns. And these are not just the yes and no of the pendulum, but they are actual different shapes, 9 different shapes. In fact, more have been discovered since that, which they also link back to the paradise time. And they used a pendulum of basalt. So basalt will come into the story. So we have the Holy Grail, we have the aurora, we have the resonance patterns, and also the story of Parzival will gradually enter into the story as well. So I'll begin with Rudolf Steiner's description of the very earliest time of the Earth, and it's from his Egyptian Myths and Legends lectures, and he points out how all the Earth's various peoples who have legends and stories are really speaking of a real time at the beginning of evolution. So all the fairy tales and legends are actually true. So here, in his Egyptian Myths and Legends, he is talking about the beginning of Earth evolution and says it is really not easy to portray the splendor of the Earth at that time. This is paradise. We must picture it as a light-filled globe, shone round by light-bearing clouds and generating wonderful phenomena of light and color. Had one been able to feel this earth with his hands, he would have perceived warmth phenomena. The luminous masses surged back and forth. Within them were all the human beings of today, woven through by all the spiritual beings who rayed forth light in manifold grandeur and beauty. Outside was the earth cosmos in its great variety. Inside, with the light flowing about him, was man, in close connection with the divine spiritual beings, raying streams of light into the outer sphere. From the beginning, the earth was not only glowing and shining, but was also resounding. So, if we look at the legend of Parzival, we see how his experiences in the Grail Castle are to do with the music of the spheres, with sound. So we have a parallel with the Grail Castle and the beginning of the earth, with paradise. So we begin to have a connection with the Grail and with paradise. So now to go to these two scientists and their work. They speak about how healthy water contains all necessary information for life, like an echo of the paradise state at the beginning of our Earth evolution. So if we compare this with Steiner's quotation, we see that these two Austrian scientists, who actually knew nothing of Steiner's work, I asked them and they were not familiar with it at all, are actually corroborating Steiner's statements about the beginning of Earth. So then we go on, and during their course, they speak about energy transfer, which they are investigating with their pendulums. Energy transfer has to be understood as the basis for life on Earth. Our planet was shaped by the evolution of water, which was, is, and will be the media for the transport of vibrational energy. The earth body's most characteristic feature is its resounding quality. So again, they're mirroring this early description of the earth, which differs from region to region, and from one level of evolution to another. We may call this resounding quality of the earth body music. The resounding system of the earth underwent so many changes that it is very difficult to reconstruct those parts that were completely lost long ago. So then we look at a further description, at a description of the Grail story from Parzival, and it speaks of how Parzival enters the Grail castle, which is out of time and space, and witnesses there the mystery of man and the cosmos, out of which he has been created, but does not yet understand the meaning of the colours, numbers, and changing forms of the Grail procession. He does not yet understand the living relationships between the celestial harmonies who weave creation from beyond the world of sense. So, here in his reference to celestial harmonies, we again remember Steiner's words about how from the beginning the earth was not only glowing and shining, but was also resounding, and of Gernot and Maria's description of the resonance patterns. So if we continue Steiner's description of paradise, he speaks of a time towards the end of this period when an event happened which I will describe in more detail later. After the fall, the sun left the earth, that the earth was originally this original paradise time. All of the planets of our solar system, the sun and the moon and the earth, were together, but in such a subtle state. There was no matter, no water at that original time, only air and light and colour. But at the fall, this condensed, and the sun, which was purely a subtle body, was forced to leave the earth. And at that point, Steiner describes how, and the tone had remained in the earth. So sound had remained in the earth, even though the initial paradise state had come to an end. So when the light of the sun departed, the water became dark, but also drenched with tone. It was tone that gave form to the water, as one may learn from the well-known experiment in physics. We see that tone is something formative, a shaping force, since through tone the parts are arranged in order. Tone is a shaping power, and it is this that formed the body out of the water. This was the force of tone which had remained in the earth. It was tone, it was sound, that rang through the earth, out of which the human form, containing the whole of creation within itself, shaped itself. So here we have again a parallel with what Gernot and Maria were saying about the paradise time, and this is the time just after. Now we can also now move to a statement that Steiner made about the Holy Grail. We have just been looking at the paradise time, which was when the earth was purely subtle energy. And here in a lecture on Freemasonry, so a whole set of lectures on the temple legend, Steiner relates the Holy Grail to subtle energy. What then is the Holy Grail? For those who understand this legend correctly, it signifies, as can even be proved by literary means, the following. Until now, man has only mastered the inanimate in nature, the transformation of the living forces, the transformation of what sprouts and grows in the plants, and of what manifests itself in animal and human reproduction. That is beyond his power. Man has to leave these mysterious powers of nature untouched. There he cannot encroach. What results from these forces cannot be fully comprehended by him. And so we look then at what is the purpose of subtle energy, of what Steiner described as the etheric energy, as the etheric world, the life force. And the life force working into matter does two main things. It brings matter into being and gives it life, and brings into matter information which will qualify and differentiate. So you have the coming into being of life, but as one knows with cancer, for example, you can have a proliferation of life, but without form. So without information, you can have burgeoning life, but not with form or meaning. So Steiner's description of the life force is that at the moment it can be spoken of in 4 different manifestations. There are more manifestations than these 4, but we aren't really to know about them yet. We're not yet developed enough to know there are 7 in all, but we're only dealing with form. And the most basic of these is what we do when we light a candle. We're already bridging the gap between the physical world and the spiritual world. And so the basic one really is the warmth ether, which relates to the element of heat, to fire. Then the next one, higher than the warmth ether, is the light ether, which relates to a lower element, gas and air. And then higher still is the chemical ether, relating to the fluid state. And then finally, the highest of all, the life ether, which dips further down into matter than the others. Now, in Steiner's quotation that we looked at earlier about the Grail, he is actually speaking about these 2 higher ethers. And these are the ones that A, bring life into being, and B, qualify and differentiate it. So the highest of these 2 is the life ether, connected with a solid state, the highest etheric state, which is energy before matter, the coming into being of matter, or the coming into matter of being. And then together with that is the chemical, sound, number, or tone ether connected with the fluid state, which brings into life forms information which qualifies and differentiates. So that is the sort of basic anthroposophical or spiritual scientific background. So then we think about this information which qualifies and differentiates. We think of Parzival in the Grail Castle witnessing the colours and the forms, and also hearing the music of the spheres, which is to do with the activity of the sound ether, of the chemical ether. And here you have a description of how all these archetypal forms are held in the Grail Castle. They were held at the beginning of the earth state in the paradise time, and the basalt pendulum is actually picking up these archetypes which are connected with the music of the spheres somehow in moving form. And this is from Wolfram von Essenbach's Parzival, and it describes how in the Grail Castle the Grail was the very fruit of bliss, a cornucopia of the sweets of this world, and such that it scarcely fell short of what they tell us of the heavenly kingdom. For whichever liquor a man held out in his cup, whatever drink a man could name, by virtue of the Grail, he could see it there in his cup. So the chemical ether, the sound, the music of the spheres, is actually that which calls these archetypal forms, shapes, colours, sounds, sense into being in connection with the life ether, but working through the medium of sound. Well, then there is a symbol of the Grail, which was actually an imagination which a pupil of Steiner had not long before his death, where he saw the Grail as the moon chalice holding the spiritual sun with all the signs of the zodiac depicted round. So again, a symbolic picture of the beginning of Earth evolution, when all the planets and the forces of the zodiac were working through the very subtle and original Earth, through the paradise state. So again, the Grail connected with the paradise state. And so then we come to the moment in the Bible when the fall occurs, and you know how Lucifer and his host were thrown from heaven, Steiner speaks about how they really wanted to grasp a sort of independence for themselves, and in doing so they indirectly affected the whole of creation, so things were thrown into chaos. And at that time, the sun and the moon could not remain within the earth, and first the moon was withdrawn, and then the sun. And at that point, the harmony between the ethers, between these four ethers, was actually disturbed, because the Luciferic influence actually entered into the light and the warmth ethers, these two preliminary ethers connected with our faculty of thinking. And this is why in the Bible you have the story of the tree of knowledge, which symbolizes these two, that we ate of the tree of knowledge as a direct result of the fall, and we had power over these two preliminary ethers. Because of this, the tree of life was removed from us, so that obviously if you could think of a thing, which is what happens when we use the light and the warmth ether, if you could then use the chemical ether and the life ether, you would actually be able to create a living being from your thought. Now, when an architect is designing a building, he's beginning to work with the chemical ether because he's having an idea, a plan, and he is actually drawing the dimensions onto the paper. And then when the building comes into being, in an indirect way, the life ether is coming into it. So this is where the whole Masonic thing comes in, and the Freemasons and the designing of a building, but in a much more material way. But certainly an artist is working with the beginning to work with the chemical ether, because of the danger of a human being being able to create a living being from our very, very immature center, because we were at a very immature state of evolution. The tree of life, those two higher ethers, the Grail, were removed from our use. So the chemical ether carrying information, causing differentiation, and the life ether, the mystery of the coming into being of matter, the coming into matter of being, the implementation of our thoughts, were both removed from us. So then, another effect of the fall was that man's physical body, which was in a very, very different state to the one we know of now, which was hitherto composed of warmth and air, contracted and condensed and formed a body that was first of all fluid and later solid. So it was a descent through the elements from this original state of warmth and light and color to a fluid, an airy condition, and then a fluid condition. And Steiner said it's not at all a figure of speech, but literally describes the situation when I say that through the contraction of the human body brought about by the Luciferic influence, man became heavier, sank down out of the periphery to the surface of the earth. That was how, at the expulsion from paradise, man acquired for the first time the force of gravity. It was the Luciferic influence which brought him down to earth, whereas hitherto he had dwelt in the periphery. And as I said earlier, because of this condensing, this original paradise state could no longer continue, because the earth was becoming gradually more and more physical. And so, first of all, the sun was removed from the earth, and it was taken to another sphere in space by 6 Elohim, and Steiner describes how they actually manifest the Christ between them. So the Christ is actually the Logos, which has been sounding through the paradise state. The sound which was resounding is a manifestation of the Christ. And from now on, through all the very early years of the earth, the Christ sent his benefit down to the earth from the sun. And this is why the sun god was actually worshipped by many peoples all over the earth. Apollo is another version of the Christ. So first of all you have the sun leaving, and then eventually the earth begins to solidify to such an extent. This was the time we spoke about the water being drenched with tone, when the moon was still with the earth, the chemical ether was still sounding through the earth, Then after some time the moon left, and the seventh Elohim, Yahweh or Jehovah, removed the moon to a separate sphere, so that the earth was left on its own, finally. Now, what I found very interesting, from the book of Genesis, we go back to the trees in the Garden of Eden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said of the fruit, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Therefore the Lord sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken, Adam. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword to keep the way of the tree of life. And Steiner has described in scientific terms, because here we bring the religious books together with science, how the center of the sun is in fact emptier than empty, negative space, antimatter. And in his book, The Sun, The Ancient Mysteries and a New Physics, Georg Blattmann related how a friend of his, an advisor to NASA and the US Air Force, a man with several degrees and expert in these fields, said to the author, "One would not like to admit what observation has shown in the last years, namely that the sun is not a body at all, as previously understood, but consists of plasma." And the term plasma means a non-material state. And he also said, fundamental rethinking is necessary for a true understanding of the sun, but this is avoided. Yet to speak of a plasma sphere and use ideas far removed from ordinary earthly phenomenon leads closely to a non-material position. Now this is a scientist from NASA speaking, so coming very close to Steiner's statements at the beginning of the last century. And he goes on to describe the sun. And remember about the flaming sword guarding the tree of life? And I suddenly wondered, this is only my imagination, if this is describing that the actual flames of the sun, the outer sphere of the sun, which is fire, guarding this element, this life ether center, which was removed by the six Elohim, couldn't be compared to the flaming sword. So if you read, the surface which appears so smooth and shining to the naked eye, the surface of the sun, appears through the telescope as a bubbling, boiling cauldron and very grainy. These bubbles are called granules, but the expression is too neutral for the activity over there. A mighty seething of currents, a conglomeration of furnaces, a clashing together of darkness and light, a collision of foaming tidal waves, towering up one moment and thrusting down the next, a wild ebullience of thunder and lightning, all of which must be accompanied by the sound of a roaring hurricane. In terms of terrestrial experience, that is what is shown, where the opposing worlds of matter and antimatter rub against one another, collide and separate in eternal, incompatible turbulence. So here we have a description of the outer part of the sun, which is the element fire, and the inner part of the sun, which is the pure life ether, the highest region of the etheric world. And so we saw earlier how the sun and the moon left the earth. And it is almost impossible to say really where they left the earth. But Gunther Vaxmuth, who researched these things with Steiner, he was a pupil of Steiner's and his secretary at one point, has written that the Indian Ocean, somewhere between Madagascar and Australia, is the place from which, in its time, the moon broke away from the earth. This is a supposition. In this connection, it is only suggested that perhaps the coast of Africa, exhibiting as it were a rent, may have come into existence in this region on the place where whence the moon issued. On this subject, Kayser says, "But in no other part of the earth have such mighty cavities been authenticated as in the east of Africa. And if all the above-mentioned clefts were to be joined into one, they would form a cleft in all not less than 7,000 kilometers long. It has been rightly said that this is the largest and perhaps the most remarkable scar on the Earth's face. So if you remember, the point at which the moon left the condensing Earth from the exit of the sun, from the dynamic of the fall, was such that you could perhaps map out a space where the sun had left. But really, to speak of where it left precisely is impossible, because you're talking about a purely subtle state of the Earth, no matter at all. But earlier, Vaxmuth has also shown how the northern hemisphere of the Earth is dominated by the forces of the life ether. So this gave me the thought, well, if the life ether was what departed with the sun, if this highest ether of all, then maybe there is a connection. This was before I'd actually delved into Vaxmuth's writings. And he actually speaks of how the northern hemisphere is dominated by the force of the life ether and the southern hemisphere by those of the chemical ether. And he concludes this by saying, we can call the North Pole the Sun Pole and the South the Moon Pole. And this was really after I'd had these thoughts. And through this one may gather corroboration, maybe, for connecting the exit of the sun with the North Pole, just a slight possibility. And in the next statement from Vaxmuth, we find more corroboration. This is a rather long quotation, but there was so much that was interesting that when I tried to paraphrase it, I really couldn't find anything I wanted to leave out. So please bear with me and follow me. And Vaxmuth speaks of how, according to ancient legends, man began to inhabit the earth at the North Pole. In Greek mythology, for example, it was known that at the back of the north wind lies a land where primeval mankind lived. And as the north wind is called Boreas in Greek, the people beyond Boreas were called Hyperboreans. The sun, Greek mythology tells us that in the land of the Hyperboreans, the sun does not rise and set every day, but only once a year. The Hyperboreans, or as legend called them, the people of Apollo, again the sun god, did not live on the earth's surface. And we go back to Steiner's description of the fall and how man gradually descended to earth. This was the Greek legends say how they lived in the air, in the atmosphere of the earth, and their life was continuous through 1,000 years of glory and happiness. Greek mythology asks us to think of them as unborn souls, living with Apollo, and finally descending to earth, falling into incarnation. Later we'll find corroboration for this in the legends of the Aurora Borealis. It is indicated mythologically by the fact that in the end they throw themselves from the rocky mountain-like peaks of the clouds into the depths of the sea. What does this legend mean? In terms of modern geology, we should tell the story something like this. What eventually appeared as organic life upon the surface of the earth, and which was a part of the life of the planet Earth itself, has left no traces of itself in the earliest geological epochs. In the Archean epoch, there are no traces of life. It only appears in the next epoch, the Paleozoic. The latter is therefore called the primary epoch, because in it life appears for the first time. And then he goes on to speak of how the Greek legend of the Hyperboreans seems to refer to the great riddle which geology still has to answer. Whence does life originate? Does it arise from the earth or from the cosmos? All plant life originates in the life of the soil, and we have to learn to imagine the planet Earth in earlier geological epochs as being much more alive than it is now. We have to conceive of the Earth as dying gradually and becoming increasingly mineralized, but at the same time yielding up the life of the planet as such by splitting it up and giving birth to the life in the plants. But whence came the life of the whole planet Earth? It came from the cosmos. In the very beginning, this life surrounded the Earth. Then it came down from the atmosphere and took possession of the whole of the planet. And we shall best learn to understand this process when we perceive that it is repeated in the generation of the embryo. This is crowned by the appearance of the living child. but the life originates from its surroundings, from the life of the embryonic membranes. There in the chorion, in the amnion, in the allantois, the life originates. And when the child is born, the life in these membranes, the life of the surroundings of the embryo, passes away, and the afterbirth, which is the corpse of this earlier surrounding life, is discarded. We must learn to see in the development of the embryo more than the repetition of the animal's life. We ought to perceive therein the repetition of the evolving cosmic life in geological events. That was the Greek point of view. The cleavage of the egg corresponds to the forming of granite in geological evolution. All these rocks of the Archean are now mineralized and dead substances, but they were once living. They had, at a very early date, received life from without, from the cosmos. So, the realm of antimatter within the sun, which we referred to earlier, is actually the etheric realm, and it's a type of space, as we saw at the beginning of the paradise situation, devoid of all material substance, an emptiness that actually is formative in its activity, something very difficult to grasp. And the etheric realm is often described as both the source of life and the region to which one goes to first of all after death. And Steiner speaks of it as being so full of life and colour, it makes life on earth, the life that we know and the things that we see, like a very pale picture postcard. This is how he describes the difference between the etheric realm and our earthly life. So now we are thinking of the North Pole in connection with the etheric realm, and it is now interesting to look at a description of the Aurora Borealis is from the legends of the Eskimos. Remember that all of these legends refer to something very real. They're very scientific in their content, though they are very ancient. The influence of the aurora on the sphere of birth is often emphasized. Children playing would often be seen in the images of the aurora. By far the most common is the widespread idea that the dead are present in the Aurora Borealis. An example of this is a tradition from the Eskimos in Labrador. The ends of the land and sea are bounded by an immense abyss, over which a narrow and dangerous pathway leads to the heavenly regions. The sky is a great dome of hard material arched over the earth. There is a hole through which the spirits pass to the true heavens. The spirits who live here light torches to guide the feet of new arrivals. This is the light of the aurora. They can be seen there feasting and playing football with a walrus skull. So beautiful, beautiful description that is absolutely accurate scientifically, as we have seen. And in Harold Falkjetter's book, I gathered all the inspiration to put these ideas together. It's a wonderful book, absolutely wonderful. And he describes scientifically how the aurora is a phenomenon taking place whenever the high-speed plasma of the solar wind interacts with the electromagnetic field of the Earth. It is justifiable within the meaning of present-day science to look for the aurora's origin in the neighboring regions of the Earth. In this case, the decisive question arises as to whether the solar wind's outgoing effect is not so much the cause of the aurora as rather the occasion for an as yet unknown sun-related structure within the terrestrial organism, including its surrounding spheres, that gives rise to the aurora's mysterious revelation. So we already have an idea of this unknown sun-related structure. The life ether, which was removed from the paradise state at the beginning of the Earth to the region of the sun, therefore a sun-related structure. So he really moves very expertly, Falkjetter, in this book between a poetic interpretation of the aurora, an artistic one, a historical one, and these scientific descriptions. So now we return to these two Austrian scientists. And they we're speaking of basalt, and you remember that Baxmuth spoke about the granite formations towards the end of the exit of the sun, towards the end of the fall state. And basalt is a very hard and very primary stone, as you see. And Gernot and Maria describe how basalt is a magma stone. All the elements are present in basalt. All of those sounds are captured in the basalt. It is heavier than the other stones in the Earth's mantle. It is magnetite. The properties of basalt make it very difficult for us to influence it. It brings us back to this world, to reality. It has the greatest ability and quality of any stone to give one the right answers when used as a pendulum. It comes from Pauliberg, I put Austria question mark, it is Austria, from a very deep region of the Earth, contains more minerals than the upper crust, is 18 million years old, black magnetite and iron oxide, many crystalline structures in it, very slightly radioactive. All the elements are present. It is compatible with all other substances. So remember Parzival's cornucopia, whatever you looked in, you would find. Remember how everything was contained within the Earth and the planets and the zodiac in the paradise time. And this I, by some wonderful chance, by luck, found in Steiner. The time was now approaching during which the basest forces were hurled out. This is the fall. Mighty catastrophes shook the earth, and for the occultist, the basalt formations appear as the remnants of the cleansing forces that rocked the globe when the moon had to separate from the earth. This was also the time when the water core of the earth condensed more and more, and the firm mineral kernel gradually evolved. Now, they knew nothing of Steiner, but they had discovered that this stone contained all the resonances and all the elements. So here you have a possible very interesting bridge with what Steiner has said about the fall, with what they are saying, with Parzival's cornucopia in the Grail Castle, the sound of the music of the spheres in all three cases they are speaking about. And now I'm going back to my thought about the Northern Hemisphere, and sorry, this is another slightly long bit. This was from Paul Emerson, and he speaks about how there is a great ridge of ancient rock, the Caledonian Massif, which stretches from Ireland through Scotland and the north of England and right through Norway to Hammerfest and Nordkapp, far within the Arctic Circle. From within this primal massif, spiritual beings are working up into the souls of people living in these regions, giving them a certain kinship to one another at a deep unconscious level. This has often come to expression in the historical relationship of Scotland to Norway. In the region of the British Isles, volcanoes broke through the granite rocks of the Caledonian Massif far back in late Lemurian times, creating the ancient volcanic rocks of Cumbria, Northumbria, Strathclyde, Tayside, and Argyll. This introduced a new element into the character of these parts of the Massif. Later, in Atlantean times, new volcanoes thrust up through the granite crust and poured out their lava, building the so-called basalt bridge beneath the Atlantic. Its span reaches from the mountains of Antrim in Ireland to Iceland. The basalt bridge carries the volcanic islands of Mull, Staffa, and the western part of Skye. In Ireland, the Giant's Causeway leads down under the ocean beneath Iona, emerging again in the marvellous pillars of Staffa before returning to the depths. And then we're still thinking about the sun leaving the earth, and we turn to Fiona MacLeod. And she describes how the skies to the west beyond the seas were not built of flushed clouds, but of transparent flame. These flames rose in solemn stillness above a vast forge, whose anvil was the shining breast of the sea. Who among you knows the way to the divine forges? And on my way to Staffa, to Mull rather, not a very good picture, but as good as I could, of the most amazing sunsets that you see in that part of the world. So somehow the sun is represented in the most tremendous glory in the Western Isles and the west coast of England. And then, of course, we get to Staffa, and these incredible columns of basalt. And Fingal's Cave has actually been described as the ear of the world. So again, we have a connection with basalt and with sound. You might say, well, what about the South Pole? We've been talking about the North Pole. Why are we concentrating on the North Pole? And Waxmuth replies to that possible question. Now, we know about the significance of the North Pole. We know that at the North Pole, life is not wanting, but it is held in the heights of the atmosphere, whence all terrestrial life has descended to spread over the Earth's surface. But the South Pole is quite different. There is land at the South Pole, but there is only drift ice at the North Pole. In the North Polar regions, there are many animals and small silvery plants, but the South Pole seems to be without life. Within the area poleward of 60 degrees north, more than 1 million human beings live, and with them are countless land animals. But in a similar circle around the South Pole, there is not a single permanent inhabitant, nor any land animal larger than an insect. There are no trees and very few plants. Life seems to have no place at the South Pole, either on the surface of the Earth or in the heights. So we know that the sun and the Earth and the moon left the Earth, but what actually happened within the Earth itself? Steiner speaks about how the different ethers left a residue within the Earth that became subject to the dynamic of the four, and these form a region below the actual physical region, a region of what Steiner described as submatter. So the fallen life ether becomes electricity, the fallen chemical ether, magnetism, and the fallen life ether is connected with gravity, but also with a power that Steiner described as much, much more powerful than the strongest electrical discharge. So possibly we are approaching nuclear energy, or something which modern anthroposophical scientists have thought is possibly much more powerful. Steiner said that the third force, which is the fallen life ether, would be, he said, pray God man will not obtain control over it. That humanity must have nothing immoral left within them at all if they discover this power. And two anthroposophical scientists discussed this once. It was Ernst Lehrs and Georg Unger, and one said to the other, do you think that the third force is nuclear energy? And the other one replied and said, no, nuclear energy is only the tip of the iceberg. So that is something not to be messed with. But what I'm trying to show here is that there was subtle energy left with the Earth, but that was condensed and fell to a lower region. And then the event happens which, at the incarnation of Christ in the Jesus individual, the life ether is brought back to the Earth. A new beginning happens, so that the possibility for this subtle energy to once again regain its original state happens with the incarnation. And at the crucifixion on Golgotha, when Christ's blood actually comes in contact with the Earth, because human blood up to that time had been bereft of the power of the chemical and life ether, only this particular individual, I can't go into it now because we won't actually finish, there's only this one child. There were two Jesus children according to Steiner, and the one described in the Luke Gospel was a child whose body had been prepared by an individual human being who had not lived on earth since before the fall. So that particular body carried blood in its veins that had the full power of all four ethers in it, which we would have had the fall not occurred. So when the Christ combined with this child, and when he reached the 30th year, when the child reached the 30th year, the Christ entered into him, and then 3 years later at the crucifixion, that blood, which would have been our birthright if the fall had not happened, fell onto the Earth. And Steiner said, if you'd been standing on a distant planet and could have clairvoyantly perceived the Earth at that moment, the whole Earth's aura began to light up. So from that point onwards, these fallen ethers are possible. It's possible to actually transform them back to their original unfallen state. And Vaxmuth, who I've been quoting earlier, describes how each human blood corpuscle has the same amount of layers as the Earth. There are 8 layers. And these all correspond to the different ethers. So that when you actually meditate and pray in the right way, the earth beneath your feet resonates with that, and your blood is changed so that the electrical impulses are removed, and the higher, the fallen ether is then transformed to its original counterpart, and then as your blood is changed, so the earth beneath your feet follows. So it is possible that we, if we can emulate the Christ, can actually begin to transform the earth ourselves. Christ said during his ministry, "This shall ye do and more." So we all have the possibility of transforming the earth in connection with our meditative life. Now, in his book, Jutta describes again the phenomena of the aurora. The relationship to all material existence is demonstrated by the solar wind being bound to magnetic forces. So we're speaking about fallen etheric forces of the chemical ether. The plasma carries along these forces, which on the photosphere are already all-embracingly and intensively united with the sunspots. In this way, the direction of the plasma stream is diverted from the magnetic fields of other planets. As plasma in the Earth's magnetosphere, it produces light and color in the terrestrial darkness in the form of the aurora by colliding with the highly refined terrestrial matter. So here we're dealing with the fallen etheric and the potential redeemed etheric. It's a very complicated thing, so I apologize for bringing so much in. But I just feel my way through this intuitively and feel that someone with much more scientific knowledge and more anthroposophical knowledge than I have could perhaps take this further. And he then describes the shining auroral ovals take form as light and coloured blossoms above the Earth's polar regions. Into the centre of these blossom structures, pale red plasma flows from the high realms of the sun. It fills the chalice structure, invisible to the naked eye, with solar processes which pass out of the heights into the depths. And I feel that in some way this is strangely connected to the description of the Grail, the chalice structure created by the earth, which at the moment is in a fallen state, but which at Golgotha began to be changed, so that the earth itself gradually becomes a grail with our cooperation as well. Also, Falkirta describes how there must be points within the earth organism where the constant concentration of life ether and its unmodified action reach their maximum. Such points, then, of the heightened activity of the life ether are the magnetic poles, near to the North Pole, but the magnetic poles. The stream of solar particles now penetrate into the regions of the open lines of magnetic force above the geomagnetic pole, directly into the terrestrial environment. In so doing, it fuses with the funnel-shaped converging lines of force which act as a powerful brake on it. This gives rise to a barely perceptible high aurora which fits into the vault of heaven like a delicate pink cupola in the far north around Spitsbergen, even during the polar day in winter. Now, we're coming now to Parzival and the Grail. And in a lecture on Parzival, Steiner relates how Parzival was a very real individual who lived in the 9th century, and he speaks of how there was a mystery center north of today's Russia, which Parzival was connected with, and where sacred Grail knowledge was connected with the power which brings new plant life into being in the spring, a power which is innocent in the plant kingdom, but entangled with passion and desire in the animal and human kingdoms. Remember Steiner's description of the Grail at the beginning, this life force that we must really not interfere with. In certain post-Atlantean mysteries, the initiates looked forward to a distant time when animal nature, bound by the fall, would be transformed to a state where, as the ray from the sun goes down into the plant, so will man's now purified power unite itself with this divine chalice, which will manifest like a blossom hanging down from the sky, a reversal of the chalice of the earthly plant, man's transformed nature rising from the earth like the sun's ray. So now we have a return to the earth of the sun force as we work with the Christ power. So here, in a way, I felt, well, surely if it was on the actual shores of the White Sea, and I felt surely it must have been somewhere near the aurora. And then I looked in Yitter's scientific descriptions, and he says the center of the northern lights shifts slowly in relation to the North Pole. It is assumed today that in about 700 BC, this center lay somewhat north of Spitsbergen, and in about AD 1200 lay near Non-Visibirsky. It almost looks like non-visibility, doesn't it, somehow? Non-Visibirsky Ostrova, New Siberian Islands. During the 9th century, this center would have been situated between these 2 points in an area corresponding to northern Russia. In northern Russia, the aurora was a frequent phenomenon. Exact descriptions go back to the year 919 AD. So now if we look at the map, shifting center of the, it's not quite easy to see, over northern Russia. So we'll just sort of look at the main thing. 700 BC, I'll go at it from this way. 700 BC there, and 1200 AD there, and the New Siberian Islands are around this area. So between 700 BC and getting close to 1200 AD, this actual mystery center would have been somewhere in this area. And of course I don't mean that they based the mysteries on the aurora, but it must have been a wonderful physical corroboration of the inner work that this mystery group were doing, that Parzival actually visited. So here we have the Grail and the aurora connecting with this area which I feel instinctively perhaps has some connection with the exit of the sun. So we can now really connect all these, and in his book Falk-Yitter actually relates 3 natural phenomena, and he describes lightning, the rainbow, and the aurora. And he speaks of how in the Old Testament God often spoke, the God Jehovah spoke through the lightning. The Father God spoke through lightning and thunder. And how when the flood had ended, Noah saw the rainbow in the sky, and he describes this as the promise that this will not happen again, but the promise of the Christ in the colors of the rainbow. And so in his book, Falk-Yitter describes the aurora as really belonging to the future and to the Holy Spirit, and that through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, man will gradually regain the lost paradise that we spoke of in the beginning. And this is, again, Falk-Yitter speaking. Like the aurora, the spirit has always been hidden and unknown in the historical periods of human evolution. Before the Christian era, the spirit could only be found in the secrecy of the world beyond. And since that time, it is only slowly penetrating the sphere of human experience. In the same way, the aurora shows itself to human beings. It was only in the 20th century, when humanity became a comprehensive and interrelated society, that the being of the aurora came fully into appearance. The aurora's nature is like the yet unveiled spirit of the future.